look through a somewhat difficult book, the book of Judges, that we'd be able to just learn, in many cases, what not to do, but also just to learn from your word. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, so we're getting to Judges. Believe it or not, we are, at least in terms of the schedule, we are 1/4 of the way done with the Old Testament. I don't know if we're actually 1/4 of the way done with the Old Testament, because Psalms is such a large book, and we're doing it in like one day, because I'm not gonna go through all the Psalms. I'm gonna kind of give an overview of, but the Psalms by itself is bigger than all the minor prophets and like 3 other books combined. So, but I don't know if we're officially page chapter wise 1/4 of the way done, but we're making some good progress. So Judges is a difficult book, because it's kind of like, this is what the world would look like if you turned away from God. Essentially, is what you get in the book of Judges, and that's what happens. Joshua dies in the first chapter, and he doesn't nominate a successor to his leadership. Now, God doesn't tell him to do that, so it's not like he was being disobedient to God necessarily. But when you think about it, when Moses dies, Moses goes, Joshua, you're in charge now, so that there's some kind of succession plan. When Joshua dies, it's almost like he just figures, well, everything's going pretty well, somebody will come after me and do a good job. And the problem is, nobody comes up after him and does a very good job, and it leads to a lot of chaos. So the picture of Christ in the book, so to speak, is the judge, but also the deliverer, because we're going to see there's 6 different cycles of how God restores Israel as they go through this. So I'm just assuming this is. So a couple of things. It's interesting. The book is called Judges, and when we think of judges, sometimes we think, oh, that's a guy on the court with the gavel and the robe. And I had a roommate who was a law student, and we called him the judge because he had a bathrobe that looked exactly like a judge's robe, and he'd wear it around the dorm all the time. Andre, he's down in Dallas now, and he's a lawyer and doing well, but we call him the judge because he would walk around like that, and he thought he was really important. But that's not the kind of judge we're talking about necessarily. We're talking more about kind of military deliverers, if you will, in the Judges. They're people that God puts in charge temporarily to defeat Israel's enemies. But one of the problems is there's kind of this Hebrew terminology, kind of almost like a Hebrew pun, that goes on throughout the book of Judges. And it's that the book, in the Hebrew, this is transliterated, so it's not quite as good, but in Hebrew, the word for judge and for justice come from the same root word. And they're very similar. So it's almost like the Hebrew, whoever's the author of Judges, and we're not really sure who that is, probably Samuel. It's almost like he's saying, you can't have a good judge if you don't have justice in the country, but you can't have justice in the country if you don't have a good judge. So it's kind of this back and forth that goes through the whole book. So Samuel is maybe the author. He's the first prophet that comes afterwards, so people assume maybe he put together all these stories and wrote them down, especially when we get to the end and it says there's no king in Israel. We'll see that next time. But so it makes it seem like he's kind of writing this as why do we need a king, and why is David so important? 1550, so the book of Judges is long, covers about 300 years. So it's a long time. I mean, think that's like the whole history of America in this one book. So it's a long period. One of the very confusing things about Judges is there's 6 cycles, but they're not necessarily chronological. They're chronological in that all of these people came in a specific order, but there's some overlap on some of them as well. Because in the beginning, Othniel seems to unite the whole country, and defeats their enemies. But as the story gets going on, it's almost like this, they get worse and worse and worse. Some of the judges will only get, a couple of tribes together in one region and fight off their guy, and a couple more would get another from their region and fight off their guy. By the time you get to Samson, he doesn't even have an army. He's like the one guy that still will fight, and he's not even really fighting. He's just really strong, and ends up being like the one-man Hebrew army. So I always call him, the military used to have be an army of one. Samson took that literally and really was like the army of one for Israel, because he was the only one fighting, because they had pretty much given up at that point. But the big problem is you have kind of well, it's not really a cycle, kind of a decline of, they have religious compromise in the first 2 chapters, because God tells them, you need to drive out the Canaanites, and you need to follow after me. And then what happens at the end of chapter 2 is they haven't driven out the Canaanites, and they don't follow after God. They start worshiping all these other idols and false gods. When that happens, they start acting then like the Canaanites and start having all this moral corruption. We'll see that at one point they have a civil war because they look like Sodom and Gomorrah, a story that I'm sure you may not be familiar with. I don't think I've ever heard a sermon preached on the last 4 chapters of Judges. It's just not a very popular text to go to. And we'll see that when we get next week. But a lot of bad stuff happens. And it leads to civil catastrophe, because at the end of the book, it's like chaos. It's like the Wild West, where everyone's kind of doing their own thing. There's chaos. There's no one in charge. The country's out of control, and it's like we need something to come in here and fix this. And God's solution is King David ultimately, through Ruth, who's the next book we'll get to. But so this is how the book looks, essentially. There's 6 of these cycles of sin. And I kind of got cut off on the top. And so, let me pull up, see what it said. I don't know why I got cut off top. The top, it's basically, Israel does good. At the beginning of it, they're doing good. Where's my pointer? There it is. Then they fall into sin and idolatry. And then God lets them get enslaved. Now, God doesn't enslave them. He just kind of says, all right, if you want to do that, I'll let your enemies defeat you. So they get enslaved, and then they cry out to God, and God raises up a judge, and they get delivered. But then they go and they serve the Lord for a while, but then they go right back into idolatry. And it's a cycle, but it's also a downward cycle. So it's kind of like a cyclone going downward almost, because it gets worse and worse as the book keeps going on. The judges are also not exactly the greatest of people, we'll just say that. The imperfection, they get worse as the time goes on. Othniel's the first judge. He is good. He's like the ideal judge. But then Ehud is the second judge. He's left-handed. You might say, well, I'm left-handed. That doesn't seem very nice to say that. But in the ancient world, to be left-handed was considered kind of weird. In fact, they would make you basically use your right hand if you were left-handed. Even they would train you to do that even if you weren't. Even in Greeks they did this. In Greek, the term for right-handed is ambidextrous, and the term for if you're left-handed is, I think it's like deception or something. It's, however they transliterate it, it's almost like sinister or deception or something like that, because it was like, if you can't trust those left-handed people. For some reason they thought that in the ancient world. Now, I'm not left-handed, and my father-in-law is left-handed, so good thing he's not here tonight, or he may have gotten upset at me. But that's just, he's not too bad. But Barak,
he's not too bad left-handed.
He's not too bad. Barak is the second one. He's reluctant. He's kind of scared, don't want to do anything. We'll see that later. Deborah and Barak go together. She's a woman, and she has to lead the country because all the men are too chicken to do anything. So it's kind of like, what in the world's going on there? She's goes with Barak. Gideon is kind of a coward, super chicken kind of guy. We'll get to him tonight as well. And then Jephthah, his mother is a prostitute. He's kind of a wild guy. He lives out in the wilderness and has like a gang of outlaws that he has. He's just kind of a weird, strange guy. And then Samson has all kinds of problems. I mean, he put adulterer, but he's also out some other stuff. So it gets worse as the progression goes. And then they're in all different locations all throughout the country. So the first guy is Othniel. And we don't know a lot. Othniel only gets like 5 verses or something like that. He doesn't get a lot. But it says in chapter 3, verse 7, "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherah." Baal is the Canaanite storm god, and Asherah was the goddess of fertility, who was like Baal's wife in their pantheon of gods. So they kind of went together. "Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishaim, king of Mesopotamia." Now, Natalie won't let me name our firstborn that because she said it's too long and the kid would never be able to spell it. But it's probably not his real name. If you interpret it, it means something to the extent of dirty double crosser. It's kind of like his nickname. And so you're kind of reading in the text here, but it's almost like maybe he told them, "Oh, I got this army on your border, but we're just doing some kind of military exercise or something." And they're like, "Oh, okay." And then he invades and takes over their country and betrays them and tricks them. But however it happens, he takes over and rules them for 8 years. So like a whole 2 terms of a presidency or something like that. A decent amount of time. Then it says, "But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord," so think of the bottom part of your 6 cycles of judgment there. They call out to the Lord. The Lord raised up a deliverer or a judge for the people of Israel, who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. Caleb was one of the 2 faithful spies. He's Joshua's friend, who was a good spy. It's his nephew. So he would have been a good guy if Joshua was going to find a replacement for him. He may have been a good candidate, but Joshua never makes him in charge. And so he gets in charge. It says the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan, so the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So they have rest for 40 years. Now in the first part, there's not really a lot of overlap. That comes later. So everything seems to be kind of going well. He doesn't get a whole lot of time. Othniel takes over. They have a great victory. There's not a lot of details given. And you go, okay, well maybe God gave them the victory. Surely they will have kind of learned their lesson. But then right in the middle of the next chapter it says, in verse 12, "And the people of Israel did again what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against them, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord." So it's like they just keep doing the same old thing. And for a while you read the book and you're like, man, these people are not very smart. They keep doing the same thing. Well, remember, we're reading this all together. There's 40 years that go by. So it's not like, they made a mistake on Tuesday and then they made the next mistake on Thursday. It's like they made a mistake on Tuesday and then 40 years later they made a mistake. So it may be even a whole other generation. But also, even if it's the same people, there's people that fall into these kind of the same problems, and you just go, man, why does this person keep running into the same mistakes? And we do the same thing. Well, why did I lie and cover something up? When I did that last time, I got in a bunch of trouble. But people do it. So, however it happens, because we're fallen sinners, sometimes we run into these things. But they fall into it again, and Ehud, this guy, comes in and takes over. So I forgot to hit my slides here. So they win the battle, they have rest for 40 years, blah, blah. Ehud, so the Moabites. So the Moabites are down here on the edge of Israel. They are descendants of Lot. If you remember him from back in Genesis. So they're kind of cousins to the Israelites, so to speak. So Eglon comes on the scene and takes over them. It says he gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites and went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of Palms, which is Jericho. So they rebuild Jericho and they build the city back up after it's been already knocked down. That's what they did in the ancient world. They would just rebuild the city on top of the other city, which is why excavation and archaeology can be tough, because you go, what level of the city is this? Jericho has been destroyed like 8 times in history. So then when you dig it up, you go, well, which of the destructions was this, and which of the destructions was that, and it leads to some trouble. But they kept rebuilding this city. And so remember, this is like maybe 60 years later after Joshua has destroyed it. So it's been a long time. So then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gerar, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. Now we'll see at the end of Judges. There's something, I don't know how this works in terms of DNA. I am not a DNA expert, nor do I claim to be. And I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I'm definitely not a DNA expert. But the Benjamites, for some reason, DNA-wise, a lot of them ended up being left-handed. I don't know if it's some kind of recessive gene or however that works, but a lot of Benjamites, somehow in their line, they end up being left-handed, so it sticks out a little bit. And they're great fighters. We'll see that at the end of the book. They're amazing fighters, because think if you've been fighting a right-handed guy your whole life, and all of a sudden a bunch of lefties come up, you see that in boxing or something like that. If a guy's a real good lefty, he can knock a bunch of people out because they're just not used to fighting them. So it says Eglon took over, and Ehud takes in. The people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. So this is kind of how this worked. You would either conquer somebody, or you would threaten to conquer somebody. And basically you'd say, I'm either going to conquer you, or I've already conquered you. If you don't want me to burn your town down, or your country down, you need to pay me a bribe. They would call it a tribute. They would usually do this about once a year. And you would go and go, all right, you got to send your tribute in. It's kind of like the IRS. We call it that to us. So it's kind of like what we give to the government kind of thing. That you have to send it every year. You would send it to the king of whatever country was in charge of you. As kind of a bribe. Hey, don't burn our town down. We want peace. So Eglon controls them, and they go, we got to send our tribute. Now it may have been a bunch of ancient world. May have been gold. May have been a bunch of cows. A bunch of sheep, or whatever they got to do to pay them off. And Ehud gets picked as the guy that has to take this to the king. And he's God's deliverer here. It says, Ehud made himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it to his right thigh under his clothes. So remember, he's lefty. So he's going to put it like kind of under his robe on his right side. Usually if you're right-handed, you put your sword on your left side. So it's almost like he can kind of sneak this weapon in, because they're only going to pat him down on the right side. Now you might say, man, Eglon had some bad Secret Service or something like that, if they didn't check this guy. But ancient world, maybe they didn't always check that kind of thing. But he sneaks this weapon into him. And it said he presented the tribute to Eglon. And I'm just reading what the Bible says here. Don't get upset at me. It says, now Eglon was a very fat man. And he's like 600 pounds or something like that. We don't know how heavy he was. That's how I picture him. He's like some kind of like sumo wrestler kind of guy or something. But it says, when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute, but he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So he kind of tells the king, I got a secret message. Now, Eglon probably thinks, oh, this is some kind of extra bribe. Ehud wants a position, in Israel or something because he controls it, and he's like, oh, he wants something, something like that. It's kind of like when somebody gives to your campaign in politics today, and it's like, once you get elected, they're like, hey, you remember that $1 million I gave you? Now I want you to do something for me, or I want to be your Secretary of Agriculture or something like that. He thinks he's going to bribe him, basically. Again, and so he goes, okay, everybody, now the king is not the smartest guy in the world either. He goes, all right, everybody leave. I got to talk to Ehud. So he talks to him. I'm assuming the king probably thought, well, this guy is going to bribe me, and surely he doesn't have a weapon because my guards already checked him. And so Ehud goes, I have a message from God, O king. And he whips out the sword and he stabs Eglon right in the stomach. So hard that the sword gets stuck and his fat goes like warps around the sword and he can't get it out. And so it's like, you know, hey, give me back my sword. And he's like, I can't, you're killing me, I'm dying, I'm too fat to do this. It's kind of almost comical, but kind of disgusting at the same time. It says, the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of the belly, and dung came out. So it's like he rips his intestines out kind of thing. It's not the prettiest sight in the world. Then Ehud went out into the porch and closed the doors off the roof behind him and locked them. So it's like he's the only one. He locks the doors and he goes out and gets out. And you say, how did he get out? Most people think the porch would be kind of the bathroom. So he kind of goes through the hole in the sewer system to get out of this out of the city kind of thing. So he's kind of like a ninja kind of guy or something in the ancient world, kind of doing all this stuff. But so then it says, when he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, surely the king is relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber. They're like, oh, the king's in the bathroom. So no one notices this for like hours. I don't know if the king usually took that long to go to the bathroom or what, but and finally they go, man, something's wrong. They get the key, they walk in, and the king's dead, but Ehud's already gone. It said Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped, and then he goes and rallies this army of men, and they drive out the enemy and push them away and free the nation again. Because they killed about 10,000 of the Moabites. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years. Well, that's good. It's double. You got rest for 80 years. That's a good thing. So they have rest for a good amount of time. This is kind of what the sword may have looked like. Something like that. Like more like a long knife or something like that. It's about 18 inches long. So they have rest. But it's going to keep getting worse. The first two cycles are not all that bad. It's going to keep getting worse as it goes. So then you have cycle 3 is Deborah and Barak. So Deborah is a prophet. It says she's a prophetess. Now does that mean she herself is a prophet, or is she married to a prophet? That's a good question, and I wish I had the answer, and we just don't know. But she does make a prophecy in the text, so she herself probably is some type of prophet in the ancient world. They had lots of prophets. There's even some unnamed prophets that we'll see later in the book. And so she is kind of ruling the country. She has her own tree. They call it the tree of Deborah. She's like sitting out the tree, and people come to her and ask her for some wisdom and guidance, and it's kind of like, hey Deborah, I got this problem. What do you think I should do? And she gives them some advice. She's kind of like, I don't know, like Oprah or something for their country, and is always giving people advice and doing this kind of thing. But she's kind of serving as the leadership of the country, because there's no men that are willing to do anything to fight. So she calls up this guy named Barak, and she tells him this interesting thing. It says, she sent, and this is in verse 6, she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, Go gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun? So she says, Has not God done this? So it's almost like God had already asked Barak, and he had turned God down. He was kind of hiding from God. God had told him, hey, you need to go do this. And he's like, nah, I'm good, God. And so Deborah has to go and call for him and be like, God already told you to do this. You need to do this. What's going on? He's scared. And he says, I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. So she says, God already told you he's going to give you this victory if you just go out here and fight. And that'd be a nice thing if you're the commander of the army and God tells you, just do what you're supposed to do and you're going to win. You'd be like, okay, I can do that. That's not that hard. But he still won't do it. So the two leaders of the thing right now, there's this guy named Jabin and Sisera. Jabin is the king or leader or political guy. Sisera is his leader of his army, is his commander of his troops, whatever you want to call him, his general, so to speak. And so they have taken over, and they've enslaved them for, I forgot to write this in, sold them into the hand, 900 chariots. He pressed them for 20 years, so it's getting longer now. They were under oppression for 8 years, and it was 17 years, now it's 20 years. It's like God is trying to get their attention. It was like, hey, if you're going to keep running away from me, I'm just going to keep having bad things happen to you. 20 years is a long time to be under enemy occupation. And it says he had an army of 900 iron chariots. 900 chariots is a large army in the ancient world. Think of it like, in our culture, it would be like if you had 900 tanks. That's the chariot is the ancient tank, basically. If you had 900 tanks, and nobody's going to be messing with you. They'd be like, yeah, that guy's in charge. He's got 900 tanks. We got, like a couple pitchforks and, like a block or something like that. You'd be like, he's in charge. He's in good. So he's controlling them with all these chariots. So Deborah comes and gets them, and so listen to Barak's response. He's not exactly the most brilliant or encouraging guy. He said to her, if you go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Man, he is the most chicken guy until we get to Gideon. We'll see, he's even worse. But he's like, well, if you go with me, prophetess Deborah, I'll go. But if not, I'm out of here. Like, I'm only going if you're going with me. So she's like, all right, I'll go with you. Now, she's not going to fight. She's going to be kind of his advisor. But she says, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Now, in the story, you're thinking, oh, Deborah's going to get the victory, but we'll see. It's not Deborah. It's a different woman that's going to be like the hero of the story. But it's almost like, man, God was going to make you the judge, make you the great guy, because you're chicken. Now somebody else is going to get the glory. So they go up onto this mountain. It's called Mount Tabor. And they have this battle in the Battle of Jezreel. That's the Valley of Armageddon in the book of Revelation. They fought battles there all the time because it's this big, giant open field where they would always fight. And so he gets this army together, and they defeat the army. Now, they don't know exactly how he wins. There's this weird thing that Sisera gets out of his chariot and goes on the run. If you had a chariot, you'd probably not leave your chariot in the middle of battle. It'd be like, I got an M1 Abrams battle tank, but in the middle of battle, I just decided to go on foot. You'd be like, no, that guy's not very smart. So there's some, in chapter 5, they sing this victory song. It's this real long, it's the whole chapter almost, victory song afterwards. But and it says that the torrent Kishon, which is the river, swept them away. the ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. So it's almost like the river floods and all the chariots get stuck or something like that. That's kind of reading in the text, but it makes sense from a historical perspective. Chariots can't go in the mud, so Sisera, his army's defeated. He only has chariots. He didn't have like a 1,000,000-man army. He's got 900 chariots. If they all get stuck, he's done. So he takes off running, and Barak follows him. He's like running away, and he's getting chased. And he meets this weird lady. There's some weird ladies in the Old Testament, and Jael is one of the weirdest. He meets this weird lady named Jael, and Sisera's tired. He's been on the run, and and she's the husband. Her husband is a Kenite. He's not an Israelite, and he's not from their side. He's kind of like a neutral party. It'd be like he ran to Switzerland in the middle of World War II or something like that. And they were neutral. So he runs to her, and he goes, "Oh, your husband is neutral. You don't have a side. Can I stay with you for a little bit to kind of catch my breath, and then I'm going to go back to the city and get another army?" And she goes, yeah, that's fine. She puts him down, puts a blanket on him, gives him some warm milk, because they drink that in the Middle East. It's kind of like dried cottage cheese or something like that. It looks weird. But they drink it, and he falls asleep because he's wet, tired. If you drink a lot, if you're wet and tired and you drink warm milk, you're going to fall asleep. Well, when he falls asleep, she goes, "I can handle this." She takes a tent peg, which is probably about pretty good size. She takes one of the tent pegs, because the women used to put up the tents in the ancient world, so they could do this. She lines it up on his head, and she smashes him in the head with this tent peg and drives it right through his head. Told you, these stories are not the friendliest of stories. And so he's gone. If you get hit in the head with a tent peg, you're not getting back up. So she goes back out of the tent, and Barak runs up. He's chasing him, and he goes, "Hey, have you seen this guy named Sisera?" And he's like, "He's in the tent." And he's like, "Well, stand back. I'll take care of him." And she kind of, I just imagine her just kind of laughing at him at this whole thing. And he opens the tent, and there he is. He's all dead and laying there. And so then she gets the victory. She's the one that led to the victory, so she gets the credit for the victory, which is exactly what Deborah had said, that a woman would get the credit for their great victory. So they win the battle. Then they go on. He takes the army. They go defeat Jabin really easy because he doesn't have his army. He doesn't have his commander. They defeat him, and they have rest in the land finally after the defeat. And at the end of chapter 5, it says, "And the land had rest for 40 years." So a good amount of time. Then you get to Gideon. And we'll end with Gideon tonight. The Gideon story is a little longer. It's a couple chapters. So Gideon is, we like to call him Super Chicken. He is the biggest chicken in perhaps the whole Old Testament. Not exactly the bravest guy. And Gideon has this weird story, because at the beginning of chapter 6, Midian takes over Israel. Now Midian is descendants of Abraham. Abraham after Sarah dies, he marries Keturah and has 4 or 5 kids. I can't remember which one it is. I think it's 4. And one of them is Midian. So these are like another cousin. All the people they fight in the Old Testament are like their cousins, which is just kind of strange. They got big families back in the ancient world. But they take over. Now these people live out in the desert, and they're kind of desert bandits. Think of them like Alibaba and the 40 Thieves or something like that. They go out in the desert, and then when you have your harvest, they would kind of sneak in and steal all your stuff and then run back in the desert, and nobody knew where to find them. And so they end up taking over Israel during this time. It says the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hand of Midian overpowered Israel, and because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and in the caves and in the strongholds. It's like they're like so terrified, these people, they start making their own hiding places. It's like, oh, the bandits are coming, let's go hide in the cave kind of thing. For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and devour the product of the land as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, and no sheep or ox or donkeys. So they would steal all their stuff. It says, when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet to the people of Israel. Now this is an unnamed prophet. There's a lot of prophets in the Old Testament who don't get their own book. For example, we don't have a book on Elijah or Elisha. They didn't write anything as far as we know. They may have written stuff. They may have written part of Kings, but they don't tell us in the text. They don't have their own book like Isaiah or Jeremiah or one of those guys. Nathan doesn't have his own book either, but he may have written other stuff. Samuel and other things. But this guy doesn't even get named. So the Lord sent a prophet to the people, and he said to them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. So it's like, the prophet's like, remember all that stuff that God has done for you? You did all this great stuff? And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. And then and that's the end of the thing. It's like the prophet's like, end of sermon, goodbye. And you're like, well, that's terrible news. Now God's not going to save us. But then it says, the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth of Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, whose son Gideon was beating out wheat in a winepress to hide it from the Midianites. So Gideon's beating wheat in a winepress. Well, how this would look like? It looked like this is how you're supposed to beat wheat. Basically, you take some sticks and you throw it up in the air, and the wind would blow all the chaff and all the bad stuff out, and then the good stuff drops to the ground, and your work is kind of done for you. Well, you do that out in the open because you got it's messy and you got to have wind. Gideon's doing this in a wine press, which is like a hole in the ground. So imagine him like throwing this stuff up in the air, hoping he gets some wind and it all dropping back down on top of him. He probably looks ridiculous. He's hiding. He's terrified. And it says the angel of the Lord comes and is watching him do this. I just picture the angel of the Lord's probably Jesus himself, pre-incarnate form of Jesus. It says he looks like a shepherd. And so he's just sitting there like, he's probably thinking, this is what I got to work with, this guy? He's probably thinking, what in the world am I going to do with this guy? But he's watching him, and finally, Gideon notices this guy sitting next to him. And he's like, hey, who are you? And he says, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. And I just picture Gideon looking around like, is there somebody else here? Oh, mighty man of valor. Who are you talking to, buddy? I'm not the guy you're looking for. And Gideon said to him, please, sir, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? So Gideon's going to blame God. He's like, if God's with us, then why are the Midianites coming and stealing all of our stuff? And God had just told them, it's because you didn't listen to me. You didn't obey me. You turned to idols. And we'll see, his own dad has a Baal altar on his farm. And Gideon's complaining that God didn't do it. It's like, hello, you guys are worshiping a different God, and you're complaining that I'm not doing anything for you. So it says, he asks, why is the Lord not doing this? And he says, please, sir, how can I save Israel? He says, you're going to be the guy that saves Israel. And he's like, I don't think so. I think you got the wrong guy. And then he's like, how do I even know you're from God? And he's like, well, test me. So he makes this cake, and he puts it on the altar, and the angel takes his shepherd's staff looking thing, like the candy cane kind of thing, and he puts the tip of it on the cake, and it lights on fire. Pretty cool trick. And Gideon like runs away, and he has to go get him again because he's terrified and scared, and he's like, okay, you're an angel, you're from God, I believe you. But then he tells them, I want you in your dad's backyard. And Gideon's like, I don't think that's a good idea. My dad's kind of a worshiper of Baal. If I do that, he's going to kill me. And he's like, no, you need to do that. So he does it, but he does it at night. And he hires like 6 guys to help him. And so the next morning, they wake up and the whole town goes, where's the Baal altar? How did it get destroyed? They cut it down or burned it or whatever. And, he does it. Somebody squeals on him and they're like, Gideon did it. And they're going to kill him. Now these are Israelites that are so upset that they destroyed a pagan altar that they want to kill Gideon. It's kind of showing you just how bad Israel is at this point. It's going to only get worse as the book goes on. But Gideon's dad comes out and they're like, hey, we're going to kill your son. And he's like, why? What did he do? And they're like, he burnt down the Baal altar. And he's like, wow, I thought he was kind of a loser. I didn't know he could do anything, kind of thing. His dad is not exactly affirming. And so his dad finally says, well, if he destroyed the Baal altar, then Baal will take care of him and kill him, because if he's really a god, he will do it. And so he changes his name to Zerubbabel, which means let Baal kill him. Like today, if you destroyed some kind of Islamic statue or something, your dad named you, well, let's just name you, let Allah kill him. And then if Allah's real, he'll kill him. You'd be like, man, Dad, you don't really like me at all, do you? But that's kind of how the story goes. And so then you have the story with the fleece. God comes to him again, and God says, hey, okay, I need you to gather the army. And he's like, I'm not really quite sure I'm still on the same page. And so he does this whole thing with the fleece. And the fleece is a sign, it's a miracle. Now, sometimes people will say, I'm going to put out my fleece, and they're meaning it kind of like, in today's standards, kind of like, I want God to give me a sign. And technically, God had already told Gideon what he was supposed to do. It's kind of like Gideon is doubting God again. But he gives him this fleece, and he says, I'm going to give you this fleece, and if I'm going to sit it outside, and I want the fleece to be wet, but the ground to be all dry. And so that happens, and then he's like, well, okay, you got me there. So the next day he's like, well, now I want the ground to be all wet and the fleece to be dry. And so then it happens, and finally he runs out of excuses. He's like, all right, I guess I got to do this. So God tells him, I want you to gather this army. And so he gathers an army here at the valley of Jezreel. Look kind of like this. But he meets at this place called the Spring of Harod, which they found today. It's still there. There's still a spring there. But he gathers this force of 32,000 guys. Now, that's a pretty good sized army in the ancient world. Like a division today or something like that. But in the ancient world, they didn't have huge armies. But God tells him, your army is too big, Gideon. If you win a victory, you guys will think that you did it. And you'll keep trusting in yourself. And so you got to stop doing that. We can't have that. So instead, I want you to send some people away. So he tells them, tell anyone that's afraid they can go. So he's like, all right, guys. I don't know if he got in front of the whole army or what, but he goes, who's scared? And like 2/3 of the army raise their hands. And he's like, you guys can leave. And Gideon's probably thinking, I'm scared. Can I leave? And God's like, no, you're in charge. You can't leave. You're in charge. So then he's like, man, I only got 10,000 guys. That's not a very good army. So then God tells him, go to this spring. And this is where you get this whole story of the suckers and the lappers. What it is there's like 9,000 and 10,000 of them that suck from the water, and there's like 300 that kind of cup it in their hands and drink it like this, like a bowl kind of thing. And it's just how people drink water. There's nothing significant about it. It's not like, oh, they were smart and they were stupid or anything like that. It's just how you drink water. But it was a way for God to do it. He goes, all the suckers get on one side and all the lappers get on the other. And he's like, all the suckers, send them home. And he's like, that's 10,000 men. That's like our whole army. He's like, I know, you'll be fine. So he's got 300 men at this point. And so Gideon's like, God, how in the world are we going to do this? We got 300 men. There's like a whole army on the other side of this. So he gets terrified. And he says, Gideon, I know you're scared. I'm going to build your confidence up. So he goes, I want you to go down to the camp of the Midianites and listen to what they're saying. It's kind of like a scouting mission. And it says, and if you're scared, take your servant Purah with you. And the next verse says, and he took Purah with him. So he's still scared at this point. It's like, he's probably thinking like, all right, Pooey, you go first, and I'll be right behind you. And he's like pushing him down the hill first, like, you're in charge. So they get to the camp, and there's these two sentry guys kind of telling a story. You know, they're on guard, it's night. And the guy's like, I had this weird dream. And he goes, oh, really? What's a dream? And he goes, I had this dream that we were sitting in camp, and this loaf of bread, basically, barley cake, loaf of bread kind of thing, rolls down the hill and took out our camp. And he's like, that's a weird dream, right? And the guy's like, yeah, it is a weird dream. He's like, what do you think it means? And he's like, I think it means that Gideon's going to come and wipe us all out. I don't know how he would have figured that out outside of God telling him or something. But Gideon hears this and he's like, wow, they're scared of me. It's like he finally finds someone who's more scared than he is. And so he's like, all right, we can do this now. So he goes and gets the army and he's like, okay, we're going to take him out, God. And God's like, no, 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 slow down. You got 300 guys. This is not going to work. So he gets him a equipment. They have trumpets, which is a ram's horn. I should have borrowed Dr. Heinzen. He's got this huge ram's horn that they blow in class, and it sounds like a dying cat or something like that. But and pitchers and lamps. Now, how this would work in the ancient world? First of all, they didn't fight night battles very, very, very rarely. So they're going to attack them at night, which was going to scare them anyway. But if you attack at night, usually if you would have one guy hold a pitch, or not a pitch, a torch, one guy hold a trumpet, and you'd have like 10 guys with their swords and shields. So if you see 300 torches and 300 trumpets, you'd be like, all right, there's like 30,000 people coming or something like that. He gives it to everybody. And then they go, so they're confused. He goes, we're going to kind of trick them into thinking that there's this huge army. So they surround them, and they start blowing the horns, and they're waving the torches and crashing the pitches to make it sound like there's all this loud noise. And it's like they get woken up in the confusion, and God's confusing them as well. And they start killing each other. It's like, the fire alarm goes off in your dorm, and you're like, what's going on? And you start beating your roommate up or something like that, thinking someone's broken up. That's what happens. They start killing each other, and they're not even fighting. They're all around, and they end up massacring their whole army. And eventually enough of them get killed that they invade, attack, and drive them away. And then they drive them away enough to where the other 10,000 guys hear about it, and they go and join the army again and drive them even farther, and they have this great victory. The problem is, they have the victory, they get joined by these other tribes, which are some of the northern tribes that really weren't that powerful, actually, so it's kind of an interesting story as well. But Gideon eventually lets power kind of get to his head. You see this sometimes where people that aren't used to being in charge, if they get in charge and then they have like their first venture becomes like really good, almost by accident or something, they think, all right, now everything I can do is great. And so he gets in charge and he lets it go to his head. First he goes to this town, and the town was supposed to help him in the battle, but they didn't. And so after he has the great victory, he goes to the town and destroys the whole town and kills everybody in it. And he's like, you didn't help me, I'm going to take care of you, and destroys the whole town. And it's like, God didn't tell him to do that, he wasn't supposed to do that, so he's already setting a bad example of what happens. Eventually, at the end of the story, they want to make Gideon the king, which is kind of ironic because he's like the least kingly guy in the whole book. He's kind of a chicken, but it says, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, this is chapter 8, verse 22, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hands of Midian. So they're like, we want to make a dynasty of you. Remember, they don't have elections in the ancient world. If you became king, your son was king, your grandson was king, until your whole line was the king, until somebody killed you guys off and took over your country, and then they became the king. But you would be king until something else happened. And Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. So he says the right thing first. He's like, no, I don't want to be the king. God's the king. But then look what he says. But then he said to them, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me one earring from your spoil. Because they had gathered all this gold earrings and stuff from the enemies that they had defeated. And they answered, we will willingly give them up. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in the earring. And the weight of the gold earring that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, which is a ton of gold at this point. It is like millions of dollars, basically. And the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it, and put it in his city of Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Gideon makes an idol out of all their victory and turns it into this kind of like the golden, it's kind of like the golden calf, where Aaron makes the golden calf in the Exodus story. He makes his own version of this. Now we don't know what it looked like. It may not have been a calf or something like that. But he makes this idol out of all their stuff and turns so he's supposed to be the judge, getting them away from the idols, and he's now propagating the idols. He's like, hey, let's make an idol and worship after it. And so he gets even worse. His son Abimelech, they always say you can kind of know how good a guy is based on what his kids end up. Gideon has some problems because his son Abimelech, now Gideon has 70 sons, 71 sons actually 72 sons. Got a lot of kids. Probably a lot of wives, I hope, because if one person had to have 72 kids, that would not work out very well. But he has 72 sons, so he has accumulated all this wealth and power and all this stuff. And Abimelech, his son, one of his sons, decides, I know Dad didn't want to be the king, but I want to be the king. I'm going to take over. And he gets all of his relatives together, and he said, wouldn't it be a great idea if I was the king? And they're like, that would be a good idea. It's like, your dad is famous. It was a hero. He's dead now. So you're kind of living off your dad's wealth and power and name, but we're going to make you the king even though you haven't really proven or done anything. And so they decide, but he's like, I got all these brothers. And if I become the king, one of them could try to usurp my authority and they could do this. So he rallies up this army and he captures all of his brothers and he executes all of them on the same, it says on the same rock. So it's like he just lines them up one after the other and kills them all. 70 brothers. But one of them escapes. This guy named, did I write it in here? No, I forgot to put it in PowerPoint. But I think it's Japheth or something like that. I can't remember his name now, but he escapes, or Jotham, he escapes and kind of runs off, and he tells this weird parable. You want to hear a weird parable, read Jotham's parable. It's like trees are talking and all this kind of weird, it's like Middle Earth or something like that in this parable. But it's a parable saying basically Abimelech is bad, he's going to die, and God's going to take care of this situation. So Abimelech takes over, and says he ruled Israel for 3 years. And then he goes to this town and encircles the town, and it's like, the town is like rebelling against him. And they're like, you're a terrible king. We didn't want you the king. You're not our king. You're not a real king kind of thing. And so he's like, well, fine, if you're not going to do that, I'm just going to burn your town down. So he encircles this town, and the town has this large tower. Now, I don't know how big a large tower was in the ancient world. You know, you think of large tower, you think of like, was it 20 stories tall, or was it 3 stories tall? It's obviously fairly tall because they drop a rock off of it and it kills them. it's got to be somewhat Hall, but we're not talking about like the World Trade Center here or something. This is an ancient world. Large tower was not very big. But they have this large tower, and he burns like half the town down, and everybody runs into this tower and goes up to the top of the tower for protection, and he encircles it, and he's about to light the bottom of the tower on fire and burn them all out. So he's a corrupt, evil guy. He's just not a very good guy in the story. And one of these women in this story says, Abimelech went there. There was a tower in the city, and all the men and women, and all the leaders of the city fled to it and shut themselves in, and they were up on the roof of the tower. And Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it and drew near to the door of the tower to burn it with fire. And a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. So it didn't end well for him. She throws a millstone. Millstone's a pretty good sized stone. Hits him in the head and kills him. Then he called quickly of the young man, his armor bearer, and said, "Draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, a woman killed me." So he's like, I want you, he gets his armor bearer and says, "You kill me before I die from my head getting bashed in, because I don't want to be embarrassed by telling everybody a woman killed me." So he is so out there and over the top, it's just crazy. So they kill him. The young man thrust him with the sword and he died. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, everyone departed to his home. Thus God returned the evil of Abimelech when he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads, and upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. So it's almost like it's kind of the end of the first act, so to speak, of the book. And then Jephthah, Samson, and the epilogue is the second half of the book. And so it's like you stop here and you go, man, could it get any worse? This seems like the whole country's just in chaos. And it's almost like you get here and you go, yeah, it can get worse, and it's going to get worse, and we'll see how it gets worse. And we'll do that next week because it's already 7 o'clock. So good thing I stopped at Gideon. But so next week we'll talk about Jephthah, who probably sacrificed his daughter. We'll see that when we get there. And Samson, who's just a really bad guy. I know he's kind of cool when you're a little kid and everyone wants to be Samson, but when you actually read the Samson story, not the greatest of stories. And then we'll see the end of the book as well. So we'll close out with that. So, God, we thank you for this day. God, we pray that as we look at these stories, they're not just stories we read and find interesting, but we see some principles that we can take and learn from and apply to our lives, and see what happens when a people and a nation turn away from you, God, and as we go through our own lives and have times of trials and distress, that we wouldn't turn away from you as well, and run into similar situations. And so we pray that as we continue our study next week and throughout the rest of the Old Testament, that we continue to learn just more about you and your patience in the Old Testament as well. In Jesus' name, amen.